Another package that we will cover in this course, it is tenancy for laravel.com, also known as archtechx tenancy, previously known as Stancil tenancy because it was created by Samuel Stancil, and later it was rebranded or acquired, as I understand, by archtechx company. And this package works with both single database and multiple database. In this section of the course, we will try to use it for single database case, and later we will come back to this package for the multiple databases for more complex use case. And generally, this package and also the following package of Spati multi-tenancy help us with defining the tenants. So they have separate tenants model and tenants database structure, and provide various methods around that tenant, like identification of the tenant, like changing the tenants and stuff like that. So let's try to install it. As a starting point, I go back to our general registration and tasks and projects CRUD without any multi-tenancy, without any filters or scopes or traits. And now let's try to create our tenant and go through basically the same checklist of creating the tenant, limiting the records by tenant, and everything around that. So I will use quick start tutorial. We use composer required to install the package. Then we need to actually perform the installation command. It will create a few files needed for the package. Part of that is migration, and we need to run the migrations, which will be, from what I remember, 2 database tables, tenants and domains. And this is the first feature of the package. It separates the domains as a separate database table, and then domain belongs to a tenant. Next, we need to add a service provider to the config app tenancy server provider class. So we open config app PHP, and in the list of service providers of the default Laravel, we add the one with tenancy service provider class here. Next step is creating a tenant model. So we do have tenants in the database migrated, and the migration structure is this. So we have 2 migration files. We have tenants as the database. By the way, the ID field is not auto-incremented by default, it is string. To use UUID by default, and we'll probably get back to that in this video a bit later. And then there's domain, which is kind of belongs to a tenant ID. So for those tenants, for the database table, we need to create the model. And for that, we will generate PHP artisan make model tenant, but we will override the tenant content with just this. So copy all file, tenant PHP, and let's replace everything with the package logic. And this has domains is the trait that actually enables the domain functionality of the package. So that tenant is still an eloquent model, but with a lot of functionality from the package. Okay, next, we need to register that eloquent model as our main model. By default, if we go to config tenancy that was generated, tenant model is tenant class, but not our model. That tenant comes from the package, from the vendor. So we need to replace that with tenant app models tenant, like this, and then we don't need this on top. Okay, next, routes. This package suggests that we need to have 2 types of routes, central routes and then tenant routes. So in the route service provider of the default Laravel, we have API and web. And this package suggests to separate them in their own separate functions in the same route service provider and use them only for the central domains. What is a central domain? I will explain in a minute. So let's add those map API routes and map web routes, and then in the main boot method, instead of this routes, we'll have map web and map API. Okay. And that central domains come from tenancy central domains configuration. Here we have central domains, and in our case we'll have tenancy.test as the central domain, and everything else will be subdomains. So someone will go to tenancy.test, register, then they would be redirected to their own subdomain, which will be covered by tenant routes. So let's add tenancy test here. And then we go from central domain routes to tenant routes, which is by default this, which is by default created. There is a file called routes tenant PHP, and here's where you need to place the tenant routes. In our web PHP, currently we have tenant routes, these 3. So welcome is global route, auth, everything from Laravel Breeze is global route, and this one, this group, is protected by tenant and should be here, like this. And then we remove that from central routes web. Finally, the quick start documentation tells about creating tenants, but we will not run that through Tinker. We will immediately create the tenant on the registration. So let's go to our registered users controller from Laravel Breeze. And in here, in addition to the user, we will create the tenant for that user. And I decided to save you some time and not do live coding in this code because it's really similar to the things that we have done previously a few times already in the scores. So we register the tenant and assign a user to the tenant. To create the tenant, we use our own tenant model that we have created, but which has the features of the package. Then, since domain belongs to tenant, we need to create a domain with this syntax. And request subdomain, I've created that as a field in the register blade, another input for subdomain. And we get that from the request, so we create the tenant. For tenant, we create the domain, and then we attach tenant to the user that has been created. For that, I need to create a many-to-many relationship, which is this tenant user. But for that, while doing that, I encountered a problem. As I mentioned previously in this video, default IDs for tenants and domains are strings for UUID usage. So I had to roll back those migrations and then change tenants to ID. It was string ID previously, and change the domain to foreign ID. It was string previously. And to make it work in the config of tenancy package, I need to change the ID generator to null. By default, it enables, let's roll it back, UUID generator class, but if you want to use integers, as I do, in my case, I set that to null, and then the migrations were successful. So now we can register here, and also the registration comes with redirect to the correct domain, which we get from the config. I will close this thing. So we have tenancy central domains, the one that we have set previously, and I've left only my tenancy test here, and then a redirect to subdomain.config dashboard. And I also needed to edit the session domain. We already did that thing previously in the scores for other demos, so we would be able to log in to a subdomain. Now let's try it all out. I hope it will work. Register form, fake filler. Let's create a subdomain of ABCD, and we should be registered as a user and redirected to abcd.tenancy.test. We register, and we are redirected correctly, but we have error from the package, tenant could not be identified. Let's take a look. Oh, I know, because I've installed the package and configured it for multi-database. I didn't do anything for single database, so for that, the package has a configuration of so-called bootstrappers, the classes that are loaded when the tenancy is initialized. And in our case, we don't need any bootstrappers at all. We will use them for multi-database setup, so let's just comment those out. And also, while browsing the documentation and looking for the error reason, I noticed that domain is actually with the domain. I thought it was just the subdomain, but actually it should be something.tenancy.test. So let's fix it in the registration. The subdomain should be with dot and then central domain, like this. And now let's register again with another subdomain, for example, XYZ. We are redirected to the dashboard successfully. So we've created our tenant and we are inside, but for now we haven't restricted our model, our data of projects and tasks by tenant. So let's do that in the next video.